Então agora passo a palavra ao Khalid. I'll give the floor to Khalid. He will present his first. Our specific project was called Rising Powers, Labor Standards, and the Governance of Global Value Chains. This is one project of this very broad program that is called Rising Powers and Interdependent Futures. I like very much the idea of interdependent futures. Khalid, please.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for coming to our seminar. I want to also particularly thank Alfonso and Maria Teresa. They're very, very old friends of mine. I got to know them about 2 decades ago when we were... More than that? Okay, long, long time ago. So we have a long history of collaboration and discussion and debate around industrial development, and particularly how, in the context of globalization, new forms of industrial organization have been shaped. I also want to thank a friend who I got to know during the course of this project, which is Aaron Belinki, who I met through my visits to Sao Paulo over the years, and we've been talking extensively through the project around questions of sustainable development. And again, this is an agenda that I look forward to collaborating with him in the future. And then finally, to my very dear friend Mansueto Almeida. Mansueto started with us right at the outset when we began to shape the ideas of this project, which was many, many years ago, almost 2008, when we started to sort of debate and think and talk about how do these BRIC economies, around which there was a lot of excitement in the early part of this century, how might they shape and challenge the ways in which questions around global governance was being talked about. And people who were in those initial discussions, Rudolf in particular, will remember the passion that Mansueto brought to the table to bring to us questions. And he would say, well, look, you know, you talk about the BRICS, but how can you talk about the BRICS when Brazil is severely challenged in terms of the fiscal crisis? And this was a story he was talking to us back in 2008, 2009, around the time when the Brazilian government was very heavily involved through BNDES and so on around developing the champion firms strategies and so on. And Mansueto, at that point in time, was raising some very serious questions. So I'm very, very pleased that one of the, I wouldn't claim an outcome of the project at all, but I'm very pleased that Mansueto took that passion and took it into government to bring about some of the kind of policy changes that maybe need to be debated, need to be brought to the table here in Brazil. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So as Alfonso said, we have a big program of work called Rising Powers and Integrated Futures program. It brings together 12 different projects. They were done across 10 UK universities, but essentially these were all international collaborations. So they all involved colleagues from the countries that were being studied. In this case, this involved research done in China, in India, Brazil, Russia, and South Africa. Of these 12 projects, 5 in particular involved research on Brazil or on Brazil and its impact in other parts of the world, in particular the developing world. So numbers of colleagues were involved in this, numbers of different colleagues from within Brazil were involved, and they came from different disciplines. So there were economists, political scientists, agronomists, sociologists, and so on and so forth. If you're interested in what came out of these projects, the program ends at the end of this week, actually. So this is a kind of opportune time. But if you're interested, I can't get the pointer to work. But anyway, you can find our website here, risingpowers.net. And on that, you will find links to all the individual projects, all the publications and outputs that came out of those individual projects. Plus, there are videos, podcasts, and all the like. So there's a lot of material if you want to delve into that. What we're going to talk about today is about this project that we had here, which was involving research on China, India, and Brazil. And Alfonso in particular was involved with, initially Mansueto as well, on the Brazilian part of that project. In our study, what we were arguing was that we are increasingly getting to know the importance of these emerging economies in terms of global trade, in terms of finance flows, in terms of investment flows, in terms of the ways in which new trade patterns are emerging. We were also beginning to see literature, including work that Afonso and Maria Teresa did on Brazilian multinationals, work of other people like Ramamurthy and Singh and others, that began to show that there were increasingly important multinationals coming from these emerging economies. And there was a lot of interest in the literature in trying to understand how these firms might be similar to or different from multinationals as we'd understood in the literature to date. So in that context, the question we were interested in was, well, we don't really understand how these countries might challenge rules of trade, the kind of the norms and standards that shape how trade relationships work. And the particular rules of trade we were very interested in this project was rules of trade around labor standards and corporate social responsibility. So if you want to trade into the international market, particularly into markets in Europe or North America, increasingly you need to comply to standards. There might be environmental standards, there might be labor standards, there might be quality standards. Without that kind of compliance, you don't get into those value chains. But standards also have implications. They have implications for local firms, they have implications for labor, they also have implications for governance patterns in terms of trade. So that was the kind of question we were interested in. And we wanted to pose that question and think, well, who are the actors who might be shaping that debate around standards in these countries? Public actors, meaning especially the role of government in terms of shaping regulatory frameworks and so on. Private actors, the role of firms, and civil society actors, NGOs, trade unions, and others that actually shape the discourse around which labor standards and CSR ideas might be shaped. So it's in that context we did this project where we looked at these three countries, but we focused in particular in different parts of the work, looking at the state and regulatory frameworks and how they get implemented. We did extensive work on firms and work on civil society. And the analytical framework that we used to this project, as Afonso said earlier on, and I think I don't speak Portuguese, but I understood enough of Mansueto's presentation that he gave you a masterclass in global value chains and explained how the value chain is structured and organized and what it means for questions of upgrading. So in that context, we wanted to understand two different analytical frameworks that come from two different disciplines. The value chain framework, which has helped a lot of people to understand the political economy of global production. How is it organized? How is it governed? How is power exercised? And what are the consequences of that? With an international business framework that is particularly interested in business strategies, trying to unpack the firm. How is the firm organized? So we use that approach, and that's what Rudolf and I have been doing over the years, and that collaboration with Rudolf goes back almost a decade when we started thinking about that agenda. So the value chain, I think Mansueto explained to you in detail. The value chain basically allows you to separate the stages of production that turns raw materials into a final product that you might consume. It might be a manufactured good, it might be food, it might be services. But it allows you to look at all the different stages that are involved in the transformation of that raw material to the final product, recognizing that each of those stages involves different sets of actors. And the key story in this is trying to understand how those interrelationships between actors along the chain are structured, are organized, are governed. Who earns value and how is value appropriated? Who determines how that system is governed? That becomes a big story around the value chain. So for example, here is a value chain for, you'll recognize this brand, it's called Performance Apparel, Under Armour, and this shows how Under Armour might structure its chain. So it produces this final output, which is sold through a whole series of different kinds of retail outlets, but that can be traced back to different kinds of ways in which textiles are sourced, are put together by different sets of actors in the Under Armour value chain. And Under Armour has this complex job of coordinating all these linkages to ensure that the fabric that is sourcing at this end of the chain leads to these kinds of end products that it can sell at different sources. Here's another picture. I mean, this is of the Boeing 787. And again, the idea is that the plane, although it's manufactured by Boeing, is made up of components that are sourced from all sorts of different suppliers, manufactured in different countries. And Boeing's role is to both design the plane, but also to assemble it and bring together the different components. Each of those components earns value in the final product, but trying to understand how that system of production is organized in a global system. So while Boeing manufactures the plane in Seattle, there are components coming from France, from Japan, from UK, and so on that are being manufactured elsewhere. So we now live, whether it's our clothing, something very simple, to something very complex as the aeroplane, we live in a world of globalized production which requires increasingly more complex governance system. And the argument is that where you are along the chain helps to determine how much value you earn. And trying to understand how you can earn higher value is the story of upgrading. That, in a sense, is the industrial policy debates that we will have today, whether it's in Brazil or other parts of the world. You want to raise productivity, but you've got to raise it in the context of being engaged in value chains. And that's the questions about innovation, but it's also about questions of getting into parts of the chain where value generation is particularly important. So it's not just to be found in manufacturing. Manufacturing is important, but you also get into questions around design, questions around marketing, questions around retail and so on, where value addition can be more significant. Another debate in the value chain literature has been about how things are produced, the ways in which production organization works, and in particular questions around labor standards, particularly women worker. So this is a picture of a garment factory in Southeast Asia, and it's part of this kind of narrative of sweatshop working conditions. And a lot of the work now amongst people researching value chains and involved in industry in terms of organizing value chains is dealt with around questions of labor standards and working conditions and how you get local suppliers to meet codes of conduct and compliance. So that's the context of what we were looking at theoretically. I want to get to another story, though, which is, I think, increasingly important for us, is the story about shifting geographies of production. Up till now, the value chain thinking in the 90s and so on was that northern firms, largely in the US, but also in Europe, sourced products from the developing world, especially China, in order to feed into markets in the global north. The story is beginning to shift, and I'll illustrate that in terms of some of the trade data, that we are now increasingly moving into a much more diverse global market, in which particularly important is now South-South trade. Consumption in the global South by production manufactured in the global South. And it's in that context that southern lead firms become especially important. So not only is the global South also responsible for half of global manufacturing, it is now increasingly important center for global consumption. Roughly about a third of global consumption happens in the global South. And it's the growing market, which is very, very significant. So that's why not only is it important for firms here in Brazil, it's also increasingly important for firms in the global North. And you begin to see this in terms of what's happened in trade patterns. So here's a story around trade. This is the share of trade held by the developing world. And you see that the share of trade by the developing world in global trade has been rising. People say it's all a China story. There's China. But it's not just a China story. It's actually very much a story of Asia. Sadly, Latin America is not a significant part of that narrative. So here's Latin America, all Americas, and it's kind of, in a sense, flatlined. Yeah. But the other thing is, who does the developing world trade with? And one of the things that we see now, again from trade data, is showing very interestingly that if you look at trade data over a 20-year cycle, whereas the developing world traded primarily with developed countries back in 1995, it's now trading primarily with other developing countries. Okay, so the importance of South-South trade is a big factor. And a lot of that South-South trade, if you look at where South-South trade takes place, it's largely a story around Asia. Okay, so it's big story around what's happening within Asia, but it's also increasing as an importance in other forms of intra-regional trade between different parts of the global south. So it's in this context we got very excited about not only what is happening in terms of global trade, but what is also happening in terms of the importance of firms from the global south. So here's some data from Fortune 500. So if you look in 2000, only 33 countries in the Fortune 500 list of the top 500 global firms in terms of net value, only 33 were from the developing world. 15 years later, that 33 is increased to 152, and as a proportion, okay, that increases to roughly, where are we? There is a figure for proportion, I can't find it there. Anyway, 152, of which the bulk come from the rising power economies, Brazil, India, and China, and within that, it's really China, that's the story. But it's also important for Brazil and India, but China is particularly important. And some of these firms you know well. So Vale, the Brazilian mining conglomerate, one of the world's top mining firms at the moment. Lenovo, many of you use it. It's now the world's biggest computer manufacturer. Huawei, which is emerging now as one of the biggest electronics player. And you know, the Indian conglomerate Tata, which is involved in a whole range of sectors from steel, to agro-processed foods, and on to financial services and so on. So it's in this context that we did the study. We focused on these three countries, and we've been trying to draw data from firms in China. We've focused on the electronics and the textiles and garment industry. In India, we looked at conglomerates that spread across a whole range of products. And in Brazil, where the numbers of such firms is smaller, the universe is smaller, we've been much more eclectic and much more heterodox in terms of the sectors that we've covered. So we've been picking from each of these countries roughly about 25 plus firms in each. So we built different kinds of databases. So we built a database using detailed firm case studies from each country. And then we've augmented that database by buying in existing databases that exist on large manufacturing firms. So we bought in databases from an organization, well, a database called Orbis that gives you detailed financial data for very large firms over a time series. And in addition to that, we and Afonso and others in the different parts where we were doing this research then conducted very detailed firm-level interviews with leading, with senior management in those firms, and in particular with people involved around sustainability issues in those firms, trying to understand both how those firms organize their value chains, but also how do those firms engage with questions around CSR and standards more generally. So this is our total number of firms, roughly the same across the three countries, and they're distributed by different sectors. So we have a very high proportion of firms in textiles, sadly none from Brazil, and then again in electrical and ICT, some from Brazil, and then a large component also in beverages and food. So you can get a sense of the kind of sectors we ended up looking at. And these are very large firms. So if you look at the total value of these firms that we ended up with, roughly, I mean, of the Brazilian firms, you know, if you aggregate the total value, it's about 274 billion. So that's about 15% of your GDP, if you look at just those firms and try to compare them in terms of scale. I'm just going to speak very briefly about the firms and then try and come quickly to some conclusions. Try not to second guess what the firms are. I'm trying to hide their names. But anyway, here's two firms from Brazil. One's a major meat processor, has a turnover about 10 billion. It has a big share in the Brazilian market. And one of the things we were interested in was trying to understand both how the firm internationalized, because what it was saying to us was, look, we can't really grow anymore in Brazil. We need to take our brand abroad. And in particular, a firm that was heavily integrated, that had its own suppliers of farms, as it were, who were dedicated suppliers to the firm. It was involved with very extensive agricultural extension services to those suppliers, but now seeking to take its product and its brand into the international market, particularly into other southern markets. So now expanding into the Middle East and using that as a springboard to get into Southeast Asia. Another Brazilian firm, a big player in the shoe sector, again, not quite the same scale in terms of turnover, but still fairly large, with manufacturing plants now increasingly in the Northeast and parts of Central America. Again, big player in the Brazilian market in terms of both shoes, but also in terms of retailing of shoes and branding of shoes, says, look, we have to expand, we have to take our brand abroad, we want to internationalize, and again, trying to sort of see how they can take that brand abroad. And this story we saw again in China. I mean, here's a couple of cases of Chinese firms in clothing where, again, big players in the domestic market, some of the, again, very, very large firms in terms of turnover, in terms of employment, all seeking to expand production, scale up by internationalizing. But doing so, having built up their own brands, their own retail systems and so on. So they may have been suppliers to the global north in value chains led by northern lead firms, but in the Chinese context where markets are growing very rapidly, they became very, very big players in their own right. And again, one of the interesting things about these firms was how heavily integrated they were, how much they went back in terms of not just producing apparel, but producing also the textiles that went into apparel. So they had a much more integrated chain than the kinds of firms we might see in the global north. And similarly, again, cases that we draw on from India. We also, if you recall, I said earlier on that we are interested in firms, but we also think that firms are being increasingly influenced by how civil society impacts on the discourse in which firms exist. So you have to understand, how do civil society actors influence that process? So we did research with where is it? I've lost this slide. Okay, we did research with about 50 civil society actors in each of the countries we were studying, talking to trade unions, talking to other NGOs that might have been influential in shaping that agenda. And again, what we see is a very interesting story when we start comparing across the three countries. So in Brazil, as you well know, trade unions, for example, have been a very well-established part of a kind of a tripartite engagement between state and business over the years, certainly since the Furtado period going forward. So trade unions have been powerful players, and then, of course, under the PT government, very much part of that governing consensus. In India, trade unions are increasingly powerful, but also what we found was increasingly fragmented, highly politicized, and caught into debates that were taking place within internal Indian politics. So despite being significant players, we found them having very limited impact in terms of the shaping of dialogues around standards, in particular labor standards. And China, of course, is very specific because you only have one trade union. It's part of the party structure, the ACFTU, All China Federation of Trade Unions. And it became, you could not have independent trade unions. So the big challenge in China has been, particularly around labor standards, is free right to collective bargaining. The state allows it, but only allows it through its singular union. And in some places, the union has been very effective. In other contexts, the union has been seen part of management, as in a sense what they call the white unions, the unions that are connected to management structures. The other story that we were trying to understand was, how does regulatory frameworks, the state, and the role of civil society help shape labor standards in those countries? And again, while it might, in a sense, if you're living in Brazil, you're very focused on Brazil, but what we were able to do in the study was to step back and provide a comparative analysis. So in Brazil, the glass might look half empty to you, but if you compare it to, say, India and China, we would argue the glass is actually half full. That you have a story in Brazil of a social contract around labor standards in particular, but also standards more generally, which has been something that civil society, the state, and corporates have been negotiating and debating over a period of time that we did not find in India, for example, and we certainly do not find the same kind of tripartite consensus in China. So in Brazil, you have strong legislation on labor standards and effectively strong implementation through your labor inspectorate regimes. And you have a tripartite consensus, and some people might say that that tripartite consensus is currently being challenged by Mansueto and his government, and that is part of your political debate to be had. But if I compare that, say, to India, where you have strong regulation, but very, very weak enforcement by the state, very high levels of informality, Mansueto mentioned that in his opening comments, and very weak interaction between civil society, whether it's NGOs or trade unions, and the corporate sector in terms of addressing those issues. So the challenge in India now is that while you have strong labor legislation, you also have very high levels of contract labor, very high levels of informality, and so those labor laws become completely ineffective. It's completely unable to make that transition. And trade unions have had very little impact in changing that discourse. So we saw no consensus around these sets of issues. And then finally in China, our argument is that the state has been the driving force in bringing about an improvement in labor regulations. The state brought out a whole series of contract labor laws, 2007-8 onwards, which did shift the real wage up, although not significantly enough. And it was seen as part of industrial policy in China. But now there's also questions about rights, individual rights and rights for workers, particularly around social protection and so on. So the debate in China has been now shifting from working conditions to questions around pensions, to questions around social provisioning that labor laws are meant to provide. And how can the state better implement that agenda? Trade unions and civil society, as we understand it here in Brazil, or might understand it in the West or in India, do not exist in that context. Nevertheless, there are civil society forces at play. There are debates taking place. They're taking place on social media, on WeChat and Weibo and so on. And there's a great deal, or has been a great deal, of labor activism that's involved through grassroots strikes and so on, trying to improve workers' outcomes. And we looked at that extensively. Okay. In terms of the, and I want to just conclude quickly then, in terms of the conclusion that we're trying to draw out on the firm side of the story, what we're seeing is that the nature of these firms are different. That is the contention we want to put forward, and we're trying to substantiate that through our analysis. The first thing is their ownership structures are different. So while all these firms are traded on stock exchange, whether it's here in Sao Paulo, or it's in Mumbai, or it's in Shanghai, or Hong Kong, ownership structures are markedly different from the ways in which we understand ownership structures of firms in the global north. So if ownership structures are different, then motives and incentives for firms can also be quite different. Many of these firms are part of large conglomerates, and again, certainly in China, and to some extent also in Brazil, the state has been a key player in trying to finance and support the ways in which some of those firms have expanded. So in Brazil, of course, the story of BNDES, but also in China, the ways in which many of these firms came out of former state-owned enterprises and so on as they develop. The second story that we're trying to pull out is the importance of domestic markets. In each of these countries, you're talking about very large markets, increasingly more demanding markets, and markets that are growing. And many of the cases that we looked at in all these three countries are about firms that built their capabilities in their domestic markets and then took that agenda abroad. The third is the story about expansion into southern markets. So the earlier literature on emerging market multinationals was very much focused around how might these multinationals enter into Europe, enter into the United States. So there was a lot of interest in firms like Lenovo and Huawei and Haier and so on. Many of the firms that we've looked at are some of those, but there are many of the others are actually below the radar. Brands that you may not have heard of now, but 10 years' time, your children will be talking about them and saying, can I get one of their outfits? And those brands are internationalizing through a much more incremental fashion. So it's expansion into southern markets that is increasingly important, regional markets, hemispheric markets, and into parts of sort of Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. And key in these markets is the fact that regulation is often weaker. So it allows you to learn and build capabilities in a way in which is less challenging, potentially, than in the global north. And then finally, while we see all these firms, and we've done detailed analysis of what they talk about in terms of CSR, because most of these firms will have a CSR report and now have a series of CSR reports, the understanding and the engagement around around CSR is actually less pronounced than we might have understood in the global north. There are exceptions. There are some incredible exceptions, particularly in Brazil, and to some extent in India, where you have particular firms where social value, environmental commitment has become part of the kind of the USP of the firm. And last night we were talking about one particular case, Natura, which is a particular firm that has built its unique value proposition behind its environmental commitments. But on the whole, what we found is that on labor standards, there is not as much pressure and engagement, partly because there's not as much consumer pressure or NGO pressure emerging from within those countries where these firms are located to drive that agenda. And to some extent, this is more marked in India and to some extent in China than it is in Brazil. But where we find a great deal of engagement and interest across all the three countries was around environmental standards, and particularly how firms start dealing with some of the kind of environmental challenges that we face as individual countries, but increasingly as a global context, which is questions around greenhouse gas emissions, renewables, energy consumption, environmental pollution, and the such like. So what are we arguing? So we have a paper that's just coming out in a special issue of Global Networks. It's a journal that comes out from the UK. This is a special issue coming out in January, but most of the papers are already available online, and they're all open access, so free to download. And the argument that we're saying is that if you look at what happened in the early part of globalization, or late 20th century globalization, value chains and production networks were driven in this kind of north-south narrative, where northern lead firms drove the chains, sourced from southern markets to feed back into the global north. Governance came from the global north, i.e. lead firms organized who would do what and where and how and at what price. And the standards regime also came from the global north. So we were very much, if you were in Brazil or India or China, you had to take the standards as a given. If you want to compete in these markets, you better get to it with those standards, because otherwise you're just not going to get entry. What we're arguing is that the world is changing. Globalization in the 21st century is going to be markedly different. And the market different that we're talking about increasingly is this importance of not just South-South trade, but that within South-South trade, it's increasingly diversified between domestic markets, the importance of regional markets, and then expansion into other southern markets. The volumes of South-South trade, as I was showing you earlier, is increasingly significant, and is for the developing world actually now surpasses North-South trade. And it's not just a story of Chinese demand for commodities. That's a big part of the story, but it's not the sole part of the story. There is now increasing demand for end manufactured goods and services in the global south. And that implies, therefore, that we're going to have new sets of trade regimes and trade regulation at this level. The importance of domestic standards will become significant. The importance of regional standards will become significant in the ways in which some of those agendas get shaped. So where does the, as Mansueto said, the research always leads you to further questions. I mean, that's always a trick of researchers, because we're always desperate to get funding for our research. It took us years to get funding for this project, and we're already in the hunt for money for the next one. But the hunt for money for the next one really is trying to understand this story about what will happen when markets shift to the global south, as they're already doing. How will governance of standards be shaped differently? So will you have different kinds of ways in which you think about standards here in Brazil, whether it's environmental standards, social standards, because your consumers begin to increasingly value this, or because you are entering into a Mercosur market where these issues become more significant? Similarly, how will China do it? How will these countries now negotiate around the shaping of standards become significant? And if you think about this, many of the new standards that are emerging are increasingly at that level. So the biggest standard in tea now in the global, in the world, is an Indian standard aimed at the Indian domestic market. And we've been trying to study that. So that's our results. If you're interested, once again, go back to our website. You'll find all our outputs there. And also we are putting outputs out into Portuguese, so it's much more accessible. And please draw on that. And thank you once again. Thank you very, very much.